Good afternoon. Yeah. Hello, everyone. So I would like to take the time to express my gratitude to the people at the Society of Fellows and Heyman Center for the Humanities, those who are responsible for the behind the scenes work involved in organizing this lecture series. And so Eileen, Nadia, Lindsay, Sylvia, Lizette, and Erin, I thank you all for your patience and cooperation with me and us during this time. So I have the pleasure of introducing our invited speaker for this afternoon. When speaking to Imane Terhmina, I made it no secret why I was drawn to her research, given that her scholarship intersects with the subjects I study and teach. By that, I mean the production of Blackness within the African continent, the coupling and decoupling of Africanity and Blackness outside Africa, and finally, the legacy of various slave routes and slave trades in Western and Northwestern regions of the African continent that extended onto the Atlantic Ocean. So with that said, let me provide a broader introduction of our speaker. Imane Terhmina is an assistant professor of Francophone studies at Cornell University. Her research lies at the intersection of aesthetics, ethics, and politics. Areas of specialization include Francophone African literature and culture, critical theory, political philosophy, petrofictions, ecotopias, and non-Western modernities. So please provide a warm welcome to Imane Terhmina.
Thank you so much, Veronique, and thank you all for being here and taking the time out of your day to come listen to this talk. Thank you so much to Sylvia and Veronique for facilitating my coming here. All right, so today I will talk to you about the manufacture of failure, or how Africa deconstructs the West. So I will start by saying that in the global popular imagination, Africa is considered usually today as a locus of violence and chaos. Due to the multiple anti-colonial struggles for liberation and civil wars, which have shaken the continent in the 20th and 21st centuries, as well as the contemporary familiar narrative of failed nation states, have both continued to place the continent under the discursive signifier of lack. So a cursory Google search for the term Africa just over the past 30 days yields these results that you can see. These are just from the past 30 days. A variety of narratives that relay this same story of failure, as you can see. The failure of Africa is thus constantly reactivated through multi-layered and intermedial devices, or what I would call nested discursive frames. As you can see in these images, you usually have a series of photographs or videos, the visual elements, which are themselves framed by a journalistic account or a bite-sized title and description, which I would call the textual element. And they are themselves framed by interpretive grids or norms of intelligibility, meaning the conceptual categories that organize the production of knowledge about the world. The interpretive grid defines not only what becomes registered as an event and what does not, in other words, what is perceived as worthy of being framed and what is not, but it also conditions the legibility of the event that is being framed. This third component constitutes the epistemological element of these nested discursive frames. In the first part of this lecture, I will attempt to introduce a relational theory that examines how these narratives and visual framings devices actively produce different types of relationships between the object that is put into spectacle, Africa, understood as a concept, not as the real thing, and the subject of the gaze, otherwise known as the audience, including you and I. In the second part of my talk, I will attempt to use this relational framework in a case study of the treatment of Black clandestine migrants in the Maghreb, which has recently made news, and a region which is, of course, liminal to both Europe and Africa, and will allow me to complicate a little bit the dichotomy between them. So part one, a relational framing of failure narratives. As Judith Butler argues in Frames of War, a historical event can only ever be captured within a frame. A journalistic photograph, a visual frame, a painting, an aesthetic frame, an administrative record, a textual frame. The very act of framing constrains and conditions the meaning that is to be derived by this frame. To Butler's point, what is framed is set up to convey an ideologically charged narrative. Thus, the need to question what does not appear in the framing of a certain event. But as she reminds us, a frame, in its iterability, can also give rise to different interpretive possibilities, ones that have the potential to disrupt the frame itself. Whether subversive or normative, this afterlife of the frame is what Ariela Azoulay, in her book Civil Imagination, calls the photographic event, which is the process through which a photograph, but this is also applicable to a narrative or an archival document, how it is deployed, iterated, and reproduced in its deployment through various contexts that are going to refract and change its meaning, a meaning that is both contingent and interactively produced. So here's my argument. The conversation around political, social, and epistemic justice is usually understood through the paradigm of visibility versus invisibility, right? Who's visible, who's not, who is centered, who is marginal. But if this visibility is a necessary precondition for securing the rights of a marginalized group, one also needs to further prompt the regimes of legibility that govern this gesture of making visible. Or to put it in other words, I would like to shift the focus from the question of what is centered or marginalized by a narrative or an image to examining the modalities under which this representation is secured or becomes possible. Specifically, what interests me is the kinds of relationship this visibility establishes between the object that is put into spectacle, Africa, and the entity that is its implied audience. More precisely, I'd like to introduce another set of criteria whereby visibility versus invisibility is further expounded through the concept of a positive or a negative relationality, which I will introduce later. First, let me try to define a little bit this concept of failure. The word failure, etymologically speaking, finds its origins in the Old French faillir, or faillir, which means to be lacking, to miss, to not succeed, to run out, to come to an end, to err, to make a mistake, to be in the process of dying, to let down, and to disappoint. The Old French faillir is itself derived from the vulgar Latin verb fallo fallere, which means to strip, to trip, or to stumble, commonly used at the time in the metaphorical sense of to deceive, to trick, or to cheat. This originary meaning of failure as deceit or trickery implies that failure is the breaking of an implicitly contractual bond, the unfaithfulness to a promise that the entity who fails has never actually given, but that is rather assumed by an implicit second party who places the expectation upon the entity that falls short of meeting it. So from this originary meaning, two observations can be derived on the discursive qualities of failure. First, a rather sort of banal observation that failure is a negative concept. What I mean by that is that failure is not the inherent quality of the entity that supposedly embodies it. Second, and the most important point, is that failure is the expression of a negative relationality between the entity that failed and the implied expectation placed upon it by a second entity. This is another way of saying that failure is a relational concept fundamentally, one that gives us valuable knowledge, not so much of the entity that failed, but rather of the implicit norm that it deceives. This implicit norm is imposed by a second entity, one whose presence is implied but concealed, whose authority derives precisely from obscuring its own subjective positionality in assessing the value of the entity that has failed it. When deployed as a discourse, failure tends to naturalize the position of inferiority of the failing entity while leaving intact the legitimacy of the normative standard against which that failure is being posited. Let me turn to the manufacturing function of failure with the case of clandestine migration. In the context of Africa, if one takes failure as the expression of a differential relation of power between Africa and the West, rather than an inherent quality of the African entity that is imbued with it, then to claim that Africa is failing can often operate as a tautological statement that ultimately refers back to a Western normative model against which this failure is implicitly being assessed. This Western norm usually takes the political form of a liberal democracy, the economic form of a neoliberal developmental model, the social cultural form of an urban, technologically mediated, nuclearized modern society, and the philosophical form of an individual, self-contained, and self-sufficient subject. Approaches to Africa that privilege this Western paradigm cast the question of Africa as whether it is failing in ways that remain uncritically embedded in this Western referential. More crucially, this discursive statement of Africa also has a number of very real sort of material and political consequences. It possesses a manufacturing functions. It creates something in the world that has a very real substance. This manufacturing function of failure reaches its peak with regards to clandestine migration. So Ruben Anderson, who's the author of Illegality, Inc., notes the disproportionality between the omnipresence in both the media and governmental discourses of clandestine migrants and the negligible statistical percentage that these migrants represent with regards to the overall migratory patterns of Europe, where they constitute less than 1% of the migrant population. The disproportionate abundance of images and narratives centering Black clandestine migrants falls under one of two regimes of legibility, each in turn actively producing its own consequences. Under the first regime, migrants are apprehended as living, but they remain unrecognizable as subjects of rights, to use Butler's language, and are usually imbued with deviancy or violence. The sheer omnipresence of these images of migrants skews the public perceptual frame into constructing them as invaders, as posing a political or even a demographic threat. This over-dramatized threat has fueled the production of an illegality business, like trafficked transit networks, etc., as well as self-reinforcing security industry, the industrial military complexes for border construction and surveillance, which is itself facilitated by the production of security-oriented reforms and policies. This established business also takes the form of subsidies received by transit states, such as Morocco, from Europe. Concomitant to the expansion of the security sector, what is framed as the migrant crisis also reactivates the mythologizing of Europe, thus reproducing a certain type of relationship between Africa and Europe, a recasting of the old imperial unequal binary in neoliberal terms. There's another regime of eligibility. This one is probably the most sort of obvious. The second one is a little bit less obvious. And the second competing regime of legibility is deployed through benevolent humanitarian discourses, which are cast as oppositional to xenophobic sentiments. A number of scholars have taken up the critique of humanitarian aid programs. I highly recommend, for instance, Miriam Tickting's The Casualties of Care, which is a great book about that. Here, what interests me is that images of African precarity appear to be circulated in ways that attempt to re-establish the grievability of the migrants. So they're supposed to be positive, right? To render them visible as dignified subjects, worthy of being grieved or of being registered as loss. For instance, these snapshots, which are from the Museo Atlantico, which was set up in Lanzarote in the Canaries. The sculptures are by Jason DeCaires-Taylor and memorialize, among other things, the death of migrants during the shipwreck of Lampedusa in 2013. So these are supposed to be sort of positive representations that are usually aimed at arousing sympathy or empathy and seek to move the audience into action, literally emotion, right? Which in Latin is ex movere, to move outward, to act, in order to produce an affective response that gives rise to a form of political responsiveness. But here, establishing grievability is necessary, but I would argue not a sufficient condition for political, material, and epistemic redress. In fact, in the case of some of these positive images, grievability can serve to reproduce precisely the kind of differential relation it tries to escape. Establishing grievability on the basis of empathy or sympathy, or what Judith Butler calls precariousness, which is the shared condition of vulnerability, basically that because we're all vulnerable, taking cognizance of that vulnerability means that we should help others, is insufficient because it still posits the Western audience as an inherently external observer, a separate entity that is not at all implicated in producing this precarity in the first place, and one that voluntarily chooses to intervene out of sheer moral or existential responsibility. As a consequence, instead of seeing its own flourishing as conditioned on the active manufacturing of precarity elsewhere, and therefore, instead of really understanding its full implication in a global economic order that produces differential effects, the Western audience perceives itself as inherently separate from Africa, but willing to help. This type of relationship I will call a negative relationality, rather than a positive one. It paradoxically reproduces the very differential binary that it seeks to eradicate. Through its production of humanitarian sentiment, the narratives of African precarity co-constitute the Western audience as benevolent subjects in the process of instantiating Europe as the promised land of human rights, the sanctuary that is to offer refuge from African authoritarian regimes. It seems to me, however, that the unbearable grief of clandestine migration stems less from the display of the migrants as inherently precarious, and more from the tragic irony of their seeking refuge in the very European arms that have participated in stifling their own conditions of flourishing. The question, therefore, that motivates my reflection has less to do with the ways in which grievability can be secured. How can we make these people visible? And more about the kind of relationship that different modes of grievability can establish, or on the contrary, foreclose between the audience and the entity that is put into spectacle. Like failure, I would argue, grievability is not an inherent characteristic of the entity that is being grieved, but it is a relational concept, one that hinges on the recognition by the audience of the entity as worthy of being grieved. More crucially, failure or grievability do not just frame their object, Africa, but they also frame the subject of the gaze as well. They act onto the audience as well. The audience is co-constituted through the photographic or narrative event. Its status is defined through the kind of relationship that is produced or reproduced by this encounter. A relationship which I will call either sort of positive or negative, but I don't mean here these terms. I don't mean it in the sense of them mapping onto moral schemes. I don't mean that a positive relationship is one that skews more towards justice and a negative one is more unjust. That's not really the kind of dichotomy I would like to put forth. On the contrary, a negative positionality is the type of relation that posits two entities as mutually separate, while a positive relationality posits the two entities as co-constituted. This co-constitution does not mean that the two entities equally contribute to it. It is therefore not necessarily the expression of harmony or equality. On the contrary, where there is a differential power dynamic, the entity who holds more power or privilege can only positively relate by fully implicating itself in having at least co-produced, if not completely produced, the other's precarity. On the other hand, it also means that the hegemonic entity's privilege is not simply the instantiation of an inherent superior ability to create wealth, to invent technology, to uphold democracy. Rather, this privilege is the direct byproduct of the differential relationship. It is, one could say, thoroughly co-constituted and conditioned by the perpetuation of the other's precarity. So as a way of illustrating what I mean here, I'm going to turn to a case study, which is the treatment of Black and clandestine migrants in North Africa. I will talk mostly about Morocco and Tunisia here, which has very recently made the news, and I think complicates things a little bit. All right. First, I am going to start with a brief historical overview of Africa as a concept. And I mean as a concept, not as the geographical location known as Africa, which will allow us to begin deconstructing some of the terms Africa, West, etc., that we use today. That the Maghreb is basically North Africa with the exclusion of Egypt. That the Maghreb is located in Africa is a rather banal statement. However, Africa's relationship to the Maghreb is not simply a matter of geographical continuity and historical ties. Rather, they are intimately imbricated in the very etymological roots of the word Africa. The first written trace of the term Africa, when it first appears in written record, is in 146 BC, specifically in the 111th Lex Agraria, agrarian law, that designates under the name Africa the Roman proconsular province located in the present-day coastal regions of northeastern Algeria, Tunisia, and western Libya. The word is itself derived from Afri, usually taken to be the name of an ethnic group of people that were living next to Carthage and who served as auxiliary cohorts in the Roman army starting from the Second Punic Wars. By the 1st century BCE, the term would come to designate the inhabitants of the Roman provinces located on the northern African shores of the Mediterranean. Many theories abound as to the origin of the Latin word. Some say it derives from the Phoenician word afar, which means dust. Others that it derives from the Amazigh word ifri, which means cave, and by extension, the cave dwellers, itself potentially associated to Banu Ifren, a prominent Znata Berber tribe who resided in present-day Algeria, and who were ultimately defeated in the 8th century during the Arab invasion of North Africa, invasions which had started at the beginning of the 7th century. The Arabs, when they came to North Africa, recuperated the term Africa, which they called Ifriqiya, and modified its valence. At the time they arrived, they differentiated the inhabitants between three ethnic entities: Ar-Rum, who were the Byzantines; Al-Afariqa, the Africans, but here the Africans actually meant a heterogeneous group of Christians who predated the Byzantine occupation and were likely of Roman, Vandal, or Greek origin; and Berbers, who are Amazigh people, the indigenous people to North Africa. By 698, the Roman region of Africa, newly annexed by the Umayyad Caliphate, had become known as Ifriqiya or Al-Maghrib al-Adna, still only comprising eastern Algeria, Tunisia, and Tripolitania, which is present-day Western Libya. Ironically, both the Maghreb and Morocco, which is called Al-Maghrib in Arabic, come from the Arab word gharaba, which means to set. In the Arab imaginary that conferred it, the Maghreb meant the land of the setting sun, which is also the Arabic reference for the West. Ifriqiya was in fact synonymous with the West in the Arab medieval imaginary and encompassed present-day North Africa, itself understood as separate from Europe. Growing up as a Moroccan myself, at once situated in the Arabic West and the French Orient, I've always been sort of very struck by the politically charged and fundamentally relational character of our geographies. By the end of the 16th and the beginning of the 17th century, European cartographers built on medieval Arab sources and adopted the name Africa, first to refer to North Africa, then progressively, as continents became an important meta-geographical concept, to refer to the African continent as a whole. In the 18th and 19th centuries, continental units were increasingly overdetermined by physical anthropology and its eugenic conception of races. By the end of the 19th century, Africa became a synecdoche for Blackness in the Western imaginary, one that conflated the complex social-political formations and ethnic diversity of its inhabitants under an increasingly overdeterministic social-political racial scheme. Carl Ritter, a human geographer of the mid-19th century, promoted the view of Europe as the land of white people, Africa of black people, Asia of yellow people, and America of red people. In the meantime, French colonial ethnographers classified North Africans into the categories of either Arab, Berber, or Jewish, and they became associated primarily with the Middle East or the Mediterranean. The colonial episteme, therefore, partitioned the African continent into an Arab and a Black Africa, two entities which were now to be understood as self-contained social, cultural, and racial spheres. The Sahara, which was deemed an empty space by colonial ethnographers, thus functioned as an epistemic fault line, one that would naturally divide the continent between these two incommensurable entities. In order to understand the current migration patterns in the Maghreb, I think we should continue to sort of critically mend the colonial epistemological gap between the Maghreb and Africa and address the long and complicated history that binds the two regions together, which is what I'm going to do next. It seems that today the Maghreb is reclaiming its Africanity. During the 2022 FIFA World Cup, after the national team's historic qualification to the quarterfinals, the Moroccan team's head coach, Walid Regragui, declared that we are African and it is our priority. Like Senegal, Ghana, Cameroon, and Tunisia, we hope to show that African football has gone to the next level. Then, of course, because of our religion, because of our origins, for a first World Cup in the Middle East, many people will identify with us. And of course, we are examples and we hope to make them happy. End of quote. Regragui's words were interpreted as an explicit distancing of Morocco from the Arab world, but in further iterations, Regragui sort of offered a corrective by making the point to foreground Morocco's Arab and African identities sort of simultaneously. The Moroccan national teams, as you can see in these images, waving of a heterogeneous multi-identitarian flag might have strategically rallied a global audience to its cause. However, its assertion of Morocco as pluralistic nation state, I think, must be challenged. This is basically what Morocco wants you to see on an international scene. What it does not want you to see is what's coming next. The term African in contemporary North African discourses has an unstable and politically charged semantic valence. In Qatari stadiums, Morocco's Africanity is loudly asserted, its syllables spelling a celebratory chant that joyfully reverberates on the global arena with the promise of a cosmopolitan future. Yet, at its Tangier borders with Spain, the qualifier African takes on the shape of a foreign, racialized, unmournable figure, that of Black migrants. Another sort of very trite way to say this is that outside of Morocco, we become proud Africans, but inside of it, Africans still constitute an ethno-racial other that emphatically delineates the contours of what we are not, of that against which we wish to define ourselves. As a case in point, on June 24th, 2022, when 2,000 migrants sort of tried to cross the Moroccan border to the Spanish enclave of Melilla, they were met with a police brutality that left at least 23 of them dead and countless injured. A now viral recording of Moroccan policemen beating Black migrants to death with their bodies sort of thrown over piles of countless others attests to the brutal reality of anti-Black racism in the Maghreb. The issue of racial prejudice in the region has most recently made front-page news when Tunisian President Kais Saied announced in his Tuesday, February 21st speech to the National Security Council that the influx of African migrants should be quickly controlled. Adding that, I quote, "The undeclared goal of the successive waves of illegal immigration is to consider Tunisia a purely African country that has no affiliation to the Arab and Islamic nations." The question really then becomes, how could one explain such treatment by North African authorities? What kind of historical genealogies and epistemes must we mobilize in order to understand it? Or to put it in other ways, how can a positive relational framework render contemporary anti-Black racism in the Maghreb more fully legible? Let us start with the ways in which anti-Black racism was framed by popular governmental and media discourses. The incident at the Tangier border, it's like it never happened. I mean, it was reported by some news outlets, but mostly it stayed under the radar. On the contrary, the Tunisian president's remarks have garnered international attention. Within Tunisia, the president's public stance has polarized the Tunisian people. On the one hand, a set of arbitrary arrests of immigrants throughout the country followed the public speeches, as well as an increase in popularity of the Tunisian Nationalist Party, or TNP, which upholds an ethno-nationalist political agenda. On the other hand, a number of Tunisian activists and journalists have condemned the president, and the city streets have seen numerous public protests denouncing the president's words as symptomatic of a more structural racism that pervades both Tunisian society and its institutions. The framings of this issue is really what interests me. They understand the racist stance of both the president and the TNP as the product of a populist far-right extremist movement that were modeled after white supremacist discourses. While racism itself in Tunisia is seen as either a colonial import or the result of a scapegoating strategy, a result of the ongoing political and economic marginalization of North Africa within the global order, which perpetuates sort of neo-colonial relations between the Maghreb and its between Europe and its ex-colonies in the Maghreb. So, for instance, one of the news coverage by The Conversation mentions this, especially the second paragraph. Migrants are constructed as a burden to an already poor infrastructure and economy, a danger to the public, and pawns to foreign-funded parties in Tunisia to colonize it again. The statement and crackdown on migrants is aimed at gaining more popularity, especially after the low elections turnout in 2022. The Tunisian newspaper Nawat dedicated several articles to deconstructing racial politics in Tunisia. Among them, one of the articles mentions, and what interests me is mostly the first sentence, to borrow from Albert Memmi, the toothless racism against sub-Saharan African migrants in Tunisia should be understood within the political economy of those who are fighting for neoliberalism's crumbs. And this is followed by a section where she talks about the globalization of white supremacy, and that we should understand this reaction by the Tunisian president as having this European genealogy. A last article by Simone Trucco links the racist backlash against illegal immigrants to EU externalization of migration policies, as well as Italian pressure, combined with the lobbying of extreme right-wing groups. So this is where things, I think, get a little bit oversimplified. These analyses uncover the ways in which the European colonial episteme continues to influence both Western and North African racial dynamics today. But the discursive framing of the president's words by leftist newspapers contributes to reestablishing sort of the implication of Europe, Europe's colonial legacy and current migratory policies in shaping the North African response to illegal migration. And to this end, it achieves a sort of like relative positive relationality between the events in Tunisia and a Western audience. However, by framing anti-Black racism as the product of colonial and post-colonial marginalization, as well as the strategy of an illegitimate president, the discursive framing of the issue, I think, misses a really important piece of the puzzle, one that would reestablish more fully the implication of the Maghreb in co-producing the contemporary structural racism that plagues it. And here, again, a turn to Africa as an object of analysis would allow us to demonstrate that a little bit more fully. More specifically, Tunisia's rise in anti-Black sentiment, as well as Morocco's current unethical treatment of its Black migrants, cannot be fully comprehended only through European racial grids. Rather, they also necessitate a critical engagement with a much, much older history of conquest, domination, and slavery that North Africa has entertained with the rest of the continent, particularly since the institution of the trans-Saharan slave trade in the 7th century, which it is important to note was established roughly 10 centuries before its more studied transatlantic one. Trans-Saharan trading routes predate the Arab conquest of Africa. However, the arrival of Arab settlers starting from the 7th century and their progressive economic and administrative integration of Africa with the Middle East drastically increased the demand for slave labor, which gave rise to a relatively large-scale organized slave trade, and one that would continue in its official form until the 20th century. Black Africa offered the Arab world a more reliable source of slave labor than the older practice of enslaving captives from Europe and Asia. While the transatlantic slave trade was much shorter, it only lasted mid-17th to 19th century, it also took monstrous proportions that the trans-Saharan one never really reached. To the 12 million slaves that were shipped through the Atlantic Ocean, the Saharan slave trade is estimated to have carried between 3.5 and 6 million slaves across the desert in a period that spans 1,300 years. This is mainly due to the fact that the Islamic slave trade had a different function than its transatlantic counterpart. While the latter relied on enslaved labor as the foundation of its increasingly globalized capitalist system, the former used slave labor for domestic and political purposes. Male slaves were usually employed as private guards or army auxiliaries, while female slaves, which constituted more than double the volume of their male counterparts, were employed for domestic work or as concubines. These facts have formed over the years the basis for a sort of skewed view of this as being a benevolent Islamic slavery. And many recent studies have sort of tried to debunk this. The trans-Saharan slave trade persisted until the 20th century. So it lasted for about 13 centuries in total. Moreover, it was really crucial in shaping the racial schemes that strategically redefined Arabness and Amazigh identities through the construction of Blackness as subaltern. In Black Morocco, A History of Slavery, Race, and Islam, Shouqi El-Hamel, for instance, looks at the historical event that, as he argues, founded modern understandings of Blackness in Morocco, namely the re-enslavement during Moulay Ismail's reign in the 17th century of the Haratin, the freed ex-slaves, through which the Sultan constituted a harem of Black concubines, as well as the Black Guard. The Black Guard itself, which was the royal army of enslaved Black soldiers, was going to become actually a major political actor in the region after Moulay Ismail's death. But this massive re-enslavement, El-Hamel argues, further indexed Blackness with the subaltern status of the slave and consolidated the racial prejudice that still carries its legacy in contemporary Morocco. As for Mohammed al-Naji, master-slaves relations in North Africa not only have consequences for understanding racial relations today in the region, but they also constituted what he calls the paradigmatic bond of authority that structured the modern Islamic State. So my point really is that, epistemically speaking, contemporary anti-Black racism in the Maghreb posits the problem of an irretrievable origin. North Africa's own legacy of slavery would be insufficient to account for the complex economic and political pressures that have produced the contemporary landscape of racial politics today. The EU's migratory policies, the relative economic precaritization of North Africa in the global order since European colonialism, as well as the outsourcing of the European border control to Europe's ex-colonies are all important factors to consider. The point, however, is that racism in the region can also not be given an exclusively European origin. Rather, it is more probable that competing pre-colonial discourses and practices, which produced this Islamic form of enslavement, were compounded with and amplified by European eugenic racial grids in order to produce the contemporary configuration of racial relations in the Maghreb. Colonial and pre-colonial histories of violence that are so intimately imbricated that they cannot be so easily disentangled. So as a conclusion, this irretrievable origin can also become, I think, the site of a positive relationality, which I understand as a form of critical repair. In this case, a reparative framing of anti-Black racism in the Maghreb is conditioned on making more fully legible the heterogeneous and deeply entangled historical legacies of violence and domination. Furthermore, in a contemporary world where the economic and political future of North Africa is bound to the African continent, it becomes ever more crucial to illuminate African transnational genealogies that critically repair the epistemic gap between the two regions, one that reestablishes the full implication of North African societies in historically co-constituting the social, cultural, political, and discursive framework through which racial prejudice is reproduced. The complex positioning of North Africa as historically hegemonic force in continental Africa and simultaneously as occupying a subaltern position vis-a-vis Europe is what I would call the North African paradox. And I say this because the categories of oppressed and oppressors are usually understood as coherent, mutually exclusive entities that have temporally stable and categorically conflicting interests. The figure of the North African, however, crystallizes both of these positionalities at the very same time. And it asks us to think of ways to hold different political actors accountable in ways that the dichotomies that characterize the colonial imagination cannot. This is especially true today, where the circular economy of capital and compounded wealth has wedded North African elites to the interests of a globalized, privileged class, while it has put those who share their own historical experience of oppression in an increasing state of precarity. Situating the colonial legacy and its aftermath within these at times competing and at times mutually amplifying legacies of domination also shed light on other imperial projects, such as the very clear ambitions of Morocco and its aggressive sort of financial and political activity in both North Africa and West Africa. I was really surprised when I went to both Senegal and Tunisia to find Moroccan banks there, for instance. Finally, the continued failure of North Africa to deal with its own past allows me to conclude with a move from the concept of failure to the concept of fallibility. It is an invitation to explore the ways in which historical failures illuminate the impossibility of ever completely foreclosing the potential for human fallibility. This inherent fallibility, instead of becoming a sort of like defeatist, or dystopian thing, can become the locus of a political ethical praxis, which posits the necessity of our continued ethical vigilance about our own prejudices, our own tendencies to stumble and fall, to deceive others, to have our actions betray or fail our best intentions. Rather than seeing failure as preventing a utopian project, as slowing the arrival at a permanent stasis or state of harmony, I will finish with an appeal to consider the critically reparative potential of fully living in a permanent dystopia. And as dystopian subjects, of making our own political praxis the principle of an ethical vigilance that will always be only provisional and subject to fail, and one that finds in this very potential for failure the driving force of its own daily renewal. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for that. So I actually want to start with a very picky and probably totally predictable question, rather than the big arc of the argument, which was really interesting. So the photo that you showed of the Moroccan team in Qatar, right? I guess I have two questions that are sort of related, although maybe not. Basically, you were talking about the Moroccan coach who starts by stating, we are African, this is what we're proud of, then he has to correct himself. Of course, one of the flags in there is a Palestinian flag, right? And I guess what struck me is just saying that the sort of appropriation of, and I don't mean that in the way it sounds, but sort of claiming Africanness, even if then he has to also say Arabness, was the kind of official kind of way that Morocco, it's an acceptable way to represent itself. But it really struck me that the flag, the Palestinian flag, was a different kind of undermining, right? Because the whole question of Morocco signing the agreement with Israel and what was going on the streets with the Moroccan team and everybody else in Qatar was actually the opposite. There was a kind of like, screw you, sorry, to the Arab regimes, right? So that was a different kind of challenge, if that made sense. And the other thing, I guess, which is more of a question, is I think the sort of where you begin in the images and the disproportionate representation of the figure of Black migrants coming into Europe. Of course, I think, it's powerful and it's interesting, but it's just not clear to me that all the Arab migrants, Muslim migrants coming in are less of a threat, although they're a different kind of threat. So then what one does with that form of representation, I just wanted you to speak to that a little bit, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Should I answer every question separately? Okay. All right. Yeah, thank you so much. Well, with regards to the Palestinian flag, really it was there as well as the Amazigh flag, because basically the Moroccan team, and yes, the Palestinian flag could be seen as a sort of like attempt to get back to Morocco's, governmental policy, which just recently normalized relationship with Israel, but it doesn't really threaten the Moroccan regime as long as we don't critique basically national security matters. Everything else is fair game for us. But national security we can't really talk about. But it was part of me sort of showing that Morocco was projecting this sort of very cosmopolitan image of itself as a country that has multiple affiliations to multiple regions, and that performs a kind of cosmopolitan utopia on the Qatari stage. Really, that was the point of the picture. Because the Palestinian flag was also, I absolutely think that it was displayed in solidarity, absolutely. But also, I think strategically, it also rallied back Morocco to the Arab world as well after Walid Regragi's sort of Africanity statement as well. For the second part, yes, absolutely. Although there is a disproportionate overrepresentation visually of Black migrants. And that itself is sort of something that really intrigued me and that I wanted to question a little bit. But yes, yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The president of Tunisia's own rhetoric about the demographic replacement of Black migrants is actually something he borrowed, or at least it's a trope that he redeploys from the Great Replacement theory, which has been sort of recently repopularized by Renaud Camus in his book in 2011. And interestingly, in the Great Replacement theory, it is actually the Muslim threat that is seen as replacing France demographically. So it's really interesting that he is at once belongs to the group that is targeted by this rhetoric, and that he redeploys it in a way where he sort of flips the valence of it. Yeah. I think there was a question there as well.
Thank you. I have a question about, so I thought it was interesting, and it's always very frustrating to think about the concept of the Maghreb in relation to Africa as either or, right? Either a colonial or
right.
Local, pre-colonial dichotomy. And I guess I want to offer this and hear your thoughts about it, which is that how much is the colonial, is the idea that Africa was a whole, and that there is this colonial disentanglement of North Africa as the Maghreb and Africa as the Sub-Saharan. I guess my worry is that you ascribe a little too much agency to colonial bureaucrats in this moment of separation of North Africa from Sub-Saharan Africa. I wonder if it's not better. I don't know. I guess my question is, rather than when did North Africa stop being Africa, the question, it seems to me, is when was it Africa? And it was Africa at a specific moment of decolonial Pan-Africanism, and in the 60s and so on. But then very quickly it stopped being Africa again.
Absolutely.
And so, some of the literature like El-Hamel, they seem to say that the Maghreb is completely a colonial construct. But sometimes I wonder, medieval Islamic cartographers never thought of North Africa as Africa, right? They thought of it as the Al-Maghreb, right? As west of something, not as north of something.
Well, both.
So I just wonder about that. North
both.
Africa.
So actually, maybe the way that I expounded my argument was not clear. That's not really what I'm saying at all. I'm not claiming that there was some originary wholeness that needs to be retrieved.
Okay.
That is not at all. It's in fact the opposite, which is I posit the irretrievable origin as basically debunking the myth of origin.
Mhm.
That's what I was trying to say. Africa, the point was not that North Africa was Africa and then ceased to be. The point is that these concepts always were ideologically charged and were always produced in a certain constellation of forces. So when you look actually at medieval maps, and I didn't really have time to put them there, but when you look at medieval maps, Africa is really just the north of Africa because they, that's sort of what they call Ifriqiya. Ifriqiya and the Maghreb were more or less synonymous for Ibn Khaldun, for instance, right? Up until much later on with European colonial cartographers starting from the 16th century. But the point really is not that there was some originary wholeness at all, but rather that in the absence of an originary wholeness, how do you posit how do you think violence in a way that's actually reparative and productive? That's really the question that I'm interested in, because usually there's a sort of dichotomy that is being put between holding accountability, violence, retributive justice on the one hand, and on the other hand, restorative justice, repair. Usually that harkens back to an originary wholeness. And what I wanted to do is bring those two together and say that repair is not going back to an originary wholeness because it never existed.
Right.
But that repair, in fact, is actually about making more fully legible the fact that we are always co-constituted. And so that the entity doesn't really exist unless it is in relation to something else in some ways, conceptually speaking. So
That makes sense to me. I guess I was just a little confused by the Ifriqiya, going by the etymology and trying to
Sure.
cast south the notion of a continent.
Yeah, maybe that wasn't clear, but well, it's also because I was just tracing it historically, really. But it's not a statement about who is actually African and who is not.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
But I would like to follow up because I think the question is more a question of histories than geographies. In looking at what I call, traces of juxtaposing different memory. Because I think one of the most interesting aspects of your talk is this process of constant linking and delinking, because at least you have different geographies. If I take Morocco, which is very different, the idea of being African in Morocco, in Tunisia, and Libya are very different. And I think Libya, looking at Gaddafi and ways in which he's precisely projecting himself in the Arab world or delinking and recentering in Africa, give us a sense of a kind of instability. And the instability is expressed differently. And if you take Morocco today, it's fascinating. What are the different memories referred to? Sometimes it's Islam, and a specific Islam, which is Sufi Islam, which made today historians from Morocco saying, you have precisely to escape the geography north of the Sahara, south of Sahara, to talk about this region, which they call the Northwest Africa, which erases Morocco. The second element is the political element. The end of empire. When the Moroccans are trying to claim Mauritania as part of the Great Morocco and include part of it. And the third aspect is today that because Morocco is the most powerful financial actor in former French West Africa, they are trying to join ECOWAS,
Yeah,
West Africa.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
my question is how is race? Because when you avoided it, you used it in Africa, you say Black Africa, but you say Arab and Black Africa.
Uh-huh.
But where do you locate this very powerful concept of race and whiteness in this discussion?
Yes,
which is very French. The French were saying white and Black Africa was an Islam noir, real Islam.
Yeah.
So,
well, yeah, that's a great question. So, yes, I agree with you, and I think part of what my talk was trying to do is to say that we shouldn't look at geographical regions as this like stable, transhistorically coherent thing, but that it's always produced relationally and it's politically charged. Exactly, and it's obviously built up by historiographical traditions, but the people who were in charge of historiography were always sort of in a relative position of domination, you know, whether it's the Arab historiographers or the colonial ethnographers or anything else. But so when I say Black and Arab Africa, I really am talking about colonial taxonomy. This is how the French ethnographers understood Africa. It's not necessarily my term for it, but that's the way that they conceived of these regions as being all of a sudden incommensurable in some way, and erased the much longer history that had different conceptions of how North Africa was included in Africa or excluded, or the principles of differentiation there. So the thing is that this colonial episteme still has very real consequences for how things are thought today, especially in North Africa. And I think that we can talk about race in North Africa today because of the ways in which the indexation of Blackness as subaltern, and it is really something, I mean, if, you know, I hate to say this, but, you know, growing up in Morocco, even before sort of I accepted or even borrowed or used the concept race, which I'm very critical and resistant to in some ways, there was always the sort of subalternity that is associated with a certain either skin color or origin or things like that. But I think that in post-colonial North Africa, the point is that these much older legacies, and then this colonial taxonomy that uses racial scheme as its main category for understanding relations and differential power relations, are conflated. And they're so conflated that we can't really disentangle them that easily. And particularly, I'm really addressing also the decolonial turn because, you know, I think decoloniality can help us a lot with thinking through the colonial legacy. But in the case of North Africa, I don't think it's sufficient to give the full picture of the different legacies that are being fought on the ground of what we call race today. So yeah, I do want to maintain a critical distance, but I kind of have to use it because it's also the way that these different actors organize their own knowledge about these issues. Yeah.
Thank you for a very interesting and rich presentation. I have several questions. The first one, how do you address the buffer areas like Spain on one hand and Western Africa on the other, which historically have been either part of Europe or that there are Blacks and Muslims and Arabs living in them, so it's beyond the Maghreb but close. How these kind of buffer zones, including Chad, for example, how do they relate to your very interesting conceptualization? Secondly, the issue of language. Does it distinguish people if they speak French, Arabic, or any local dialect? How does that reflect on their identity?
Yeah.
And last but not least, I was struck, we talked about Morocco between the two worlds, that when it's conquered the Western Sahara, it also claims to be part of kind of an old empire of the Morocco, so which was Muslim and pre-colonial. And I was wondering if the issue of territorial expansion also plays a role in these identities. Thank you very much.
I can start with the issue of territorial expansion. Yeah, as a Moroccan, actually, I'm in kind of a difficult position because I can't really speak about it. But, well, it is criminal in my constitution to speak about certain things. But what I can say is that, yeah, territorial divisions and competing territorial claims, more generally speaking, probably have a huge influence on how these categories are constituted. Again, because the sort of claim that I was not really, I don't pretend to be exhaustive in any way, but one of my central claims was the fact that these terms were also political vehicles that were overdetermined by these competing territorial claims that are still going on today, obviously. The Darija versus French versus Arabic, yes, I think internally to Morocco, they do tend to get a little bit flattened when we talk about the diaspora in France, for example, where North Africans just become this sort of like abstracted Arab figure. But of course, they have different, valences. In Morocco, for instance, I mean, French, I think usually is for people that are more, middle class or upper middle class. Arabic is usually more popular. I had classmates in the French school that never even spoke Darija, and they were fully Moroccan. Because French was seen as sort of a status claim. So yeah, I mean, these things have some relative amount of differentiation within Morocco. But again, I think, so the term African, when it's used in Morocco, for instance, actually flattens all of those differentiations a lot. Because when people say African, what we mean is not Moroccan, right? Or not North African. So all of a sudden, when someone uses this word African, it doesn't really, relationally speaking, then Morocco is understood as coherent, internally coherent. And that's part of the interesting paradox about it as well. And then for the transition regions, I mean, yes, of course, I think it's a spectrum, and of course, things are a lot more complicated than a schematic rendering can ever sort of provide. So absolutely, there's probably some regional differences. And I would actually even go to say that there's probably also a very significant difference between Morocco in particular and Algeria and Tunisia because of their different trajectories and historical trajectories pre-colonially. Algeria and Tunisia were both under the Ottoman Empire. Morocco was not. Morocco went all the way to Mauritania. So it really changed all the way to Timbuktu. So it really, I think, changed a little bit how Moroccans specifically perceive these things. So, North Africa is also not to be confused as this sort of like completely coherent place. So complexity, of course, has always its place here. Yeah.
I'm not sure how we're doing with time, and we're probably close to time, maybe. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for this talk and what is bringing up to fore when we think about Pan-Africanism, maybe the history of Pan-Africanism, the idea of Africa, the etymology, what that term once meant before the European-African colonial encounter.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose I want to touch upon those instances with my question and comment. And I suppose the Pan-Africanism that Yusuf brought up earlier,
Mm-hmm.
of the 1950s in particular, from your talk and from maybe what I researched, is that perhaps the trans-Saharan trade was not quite addressed with the major actors of that time, or the idea of Pan-Africanism or one instance or one wave of it might be to repair a sort of cohesive wholeness or harmony.
Yeah.
Is that what you understand of a previous form of Pan-Africanism?
Yeah.
And are you intervening in a way to say, is there a way to repair without, how do we repair without going into originary nostalgia, so to speak?
Okay,
So
yeah.
maybe it's also, I would like for you to hear a little more about the repair that you speak of.
Yeah. Pan-Africanism, there's a book that's coming out very soon by Paraska Tolan called Maghreb Noir, and it's about militant artists and Pan-Africanism in the Maghreb. Pan-Africanism has gotten a lot of attention, especially with the Panaf, festival in Algiers in the 1960s. And it's true that right after independence, you do have a sort of generation of intellectuals, Maghrebi intellectuals, that really sort of expound Pan-Africanism, also as anti-colonial resistance, as a form of anti-colonial resistance. And so it becomes, because it's an anti-colonial project, it becomes taken up by these Maghrebi intellectuals who organize, all of these events, the Pan-African Festival in Algiers being probably the culmination of that trend. Part of actually what I'm really speaking to is this very, the over-determining of Pan-Africanism within Maghrebi history. Because the thing with Pan-Africanism is that it was an intellectual endeavor. It had nothing to do with popular discourses at the time. It had nothing to do with structural dynamics in North African societies. It was really mostly an aesthetic, intellectual, political movement. And so what I would like to address is more of the structural sort of ways in which North African societies are constituted and racially constituted. So yeah, Pan-Africanism, yes, but I think that it was a form of repair that actually tried to obscure rather than fully render legible the complexity of the relationship that North Africa has with the rest.
Thank you. It's great.
Yeah.
The question has to do with Ethiopia, right?
Okay.
Because that's, Ethiopia occurs in Homer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And played a part in the Greek European imagination. And so I understand the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, being quite separate. As you said, there's the Maghreb and then there's the other. I guess I'm trying to figure out the history of Ethiopia in particular.
I'm not a specialist. I can't really tell you a history of Ethiopia per se. What you say about the Greek representation of Ethiopians was eminently actually positive. Absolutely. And it was in fact in direct dichotomy with the Slavs, who are the northern white slaves that the Romans usually enslaved during their conquests. So Ethiopians, were seen as a civilization that was a lot more advanced at the time in Greek, in the Greek imagination. And that, has changed over time.
I guess my point is that how, when you trace Africa and this whole concept and the groups, that's the one group that seems to me that's,
Yes, so actually when, I know that at least in the medieval period, when North Africa was sort of conflated with with the term Ifriqiya, the rest of the continent had a lot of different terminologies that were ascribed to it that changed over time, like Bilad al-Sudan, etc. I mean, there was a whole complex taxonomy of terms that describe the rest of the continent. And I think Ethiopia had a particularly prominent place in that taxonomy. But yeah.
For the Greeks, Ethiopia was the whole continent. It was not the... Abyssinia became Ethiopia after the invasion of Ethiopia by the Italian. it's a shift. But Ethiopia, until the mid-1930s, was referring to Africa. I think the other element, which we, probably it will be interesting to discuss, is also the Arab vision of the Bilad el-Sudan, which is the land of the Black people. This is you have among Africanists, you have a whole discussion these last 20 years about racialization in this region. And one of my colleagues who has written a book a few years ago, which is called The Walking Quran, is saying that racialization is one of the consequences of the opening of the Atlantic and the beginning of the slave trade. That is actually infecting the region when the connection and interaction between European Africans and Arab intensified in the context of the slave trade. And it's interesting to see how actually notion of race are developing in this region.
Absolutely.
And the third thing about language, which is also important, which shows the very complex process, is the fact that, is why I ask the question of Arabs, is the fact that south of the Sahara, you have people who had always believed that they were Arab because they were Muslim and they were speaking Arabic. In the 1980s, you had this very violent discussion in Senegal about a national cultural charter. People saying Arabic is a Senegalese national language, and like Wolof, and people are telling them no. And this is still today a discussion.
No,
I think it's really
and especially
important.
the descendants with the prophet.
I think one thing which is important, you talked about that, is at which moment the shift are happening, at which moment Moroccans are saying, we are not African. When in the 50s, they are the leaders of the nationalist radical movement. And I think that in the 50s, the idea of being Arab is, except in relation to religion, is not so important.
Well,
I don't know, but I think that we need to have more information.
Yes. And Pan-Arabism really soared in the post-colonial moment in particular. Thank you.
So with that exchange in mind and final exchange of more discussions and more interactions about this topic, I will end here. Thank you everyone for coming and for your attention.